Hello, I'm Professor Rich, and this is TYT History. What I want to talk today about is the Arab Cold War, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Arab nationalism, and the Suez Crisis. Now, I find this conversation interesting because, for one thing, when I learned about it, it really changed the way I thought about the Cold War. But it's probably more important in terms of American history because this is going to be how we end up becoming the major outside power in the Middle East. Now, of course, we're dealing here with the period after World War II, where we see a lot of countries that had previously been controlled by foreign powers being given their freedom in one form or another. And Egypt is going to be one of those countries. Nasser will rise to the presidency in Egypt, really starting with a movement in 1952, protesting British influence and the British presence in Egypt. And so that's really in his background right away. Nasser will do something interesting when he becomes president. He will declare that Egypt will be non-aligned, meaning that we will not pick a side in the Cold War. I think here in America we tend to think of the Cold War as being this team sport, and everybody had to choose a side, more or less. Nasser says he's not going to do that. He says he's going to do whatever is best for the Arab world, not just Egypt, but the entire Arab world. And this is an idea called Pan-Arabism. And Nasser believes that the Arab nations should unite and become kind of a third major power in the Cold War, and they should look out for their own interest and not necessarily dance to the tune of the Americans or the Soviets. Nasser will gain a lot of support in the Arab world by doing this, and he'll become a major world figure. He will upset the Americans by doing things like condemning the French presence in Algiers. Algeria wants their independence, and the French are refusing to give it, and diplomatically recognizing communist China. He's going to get very angry at a treaty that's come to be known as the Baghdad Pact, which is a treaty between Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Turkey, and Great Britain. It's kind of like NATO. It says that all of them will team up to resist Soviet encroachment or influence. The reason this makes Nasser mad is because Iraq joins, and Iraq of course is Arab, and Nasser wants the Arab countries to all work together and not splinter off and enter into these sorts of arrangements. And so this begins to create tension. Of course, in America, we're very uncomfortable with Nasser. On the one hand, it's very important to us that we keep the Middle East friendly to the United States, of course, because of all the oil, which is why Nasser is able to become such a powerful figure to begin with. But on the other hand, we don't like the idea that he's open to dealing with the Soviets if he feels that's what he needs to do. Well, that is what he does, and he's going to take an arms shipment from the Soviets in I believe it's 1956. We are going to respond to that. Our Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, will respond to this by cutting off funding for a project we had committed to help Egypt with called the Aswan Dam. This is a large dam on the Egyptian river to control floods and create energy and that sort of thing. And we say we're no longer going to help them with it because they've had the audacity to cut a deal with the Soviet Union. And because we see the world in binary terms, you're either for us or against us, that sort of thing. We will not tolerate anyone dealing with the Soviets. Well, Nasser says, no problem, I can pay for the dam myself. And he does this by nationalizing the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, which of course connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean and really the entire East by water, had been built by a British company. It was owned and operated by a British company, and Nasser simply says, we're going to pay all the shareholders their current stock value at the close of business on this day, and the next day the canal will be Egypt, and Egypt will take all the profit from the tolls paid through the canal, and we'll build the Aswan Dam that way. He also closes the canal completely to Israeli shipping. As we know, Arabs tend to be angry about Israel's presence because they're sympathetic to the Palestinians, who are of course Arabs themselves. And this is going to further Nasser's prestige among the Arab community and really help his movement towards Pan-Arabism. Now, the other thing to understand at this time is there's something going on called the Arab Cold War. And this is a conflict among the Arab nations between those who are republics, who have elected governments, such as Egypt, and those who are monarchies, places like Saudi Arabia. Now, the monarchies tend to be actually much closer aligned to the United States, whereas the republics are either unaligned or maybe even leaning slightly towards the Soviet Union, which is interesting because here we have a case where monarchies are pro-American generally, and democratically elected governments are pro-Soviet. So that creates kind of a strange dynamic in the Cold War, I think. Well, as you can imagine, England is very angry about the nationalization of the Suez Canal. We're not happy about it. As you can imagine, France is very upset. Not only do we have Nasser criticizing the French in Algeria, but the new French president, Guy Moret, is a socialist, and he's taken a lot of heat from the conservatives in his country who say that he's soft on communism or even downright Soviet-friendly. So he has a lot to gain from standing up to Nasser over this issue of the Suez Canal. Now, what France and Britain are going to do is they're going to hatch a scheme, and the scheme is going to work like this. They're going to get Israel to invade Egypt and take the Suez Canal region, which Israel's happy to do. And then they are going to use the outrage as an excuse to try to step in, mediate, and clear out the Suez Canal region so then it can be reopened to their shipping. Now, they intentionally don't tell the United States they're going to do this because they want to give Eisenhower what Reagan will call plausible deniability, to be able to say he didn't know. But they assume that Eisenhower will support them and will move in and pressure, if not downright use military force, to get the Egyptians to do what they want. The reason they assume this, by the way, is because we had done similar stuff in Iran working with the British, and we had recently overthrown the government of Guatemala on similar grounds. And actually, the British and the Americans had something called Plan Omega, which said that they wanted to get rid of Nasser, although the timetable was much longer than what's spelled out here. And so in October of 1956, Israel invades the now nationalized Suez Canal. The French and the British, on cue, step in to stop the fighting. And they order both sides to retreat, I believe it was 10 miles from the line of combat. Well, this is the area that occupies the Suez. Israel, of course, retreats. But Nasser's not dumb. He says, this is stupid. This is my land. They invaded me. Why should I have to back up? And he refuses to abandon the Suez Canal. And so the British and the French attack. At this point, America will condemn the actions of the British and the French. Shocking the British and the French, certainly, and probably the rest of the world, as Eisenhower does not want a massive war in the Middle East, and he fears that the Arabs will cut off the oil supply, creating big problems for the United States. To make matters worse, Nasser has actually sunk ships all up and down the Suez Canal, so nobody can use it once the French and British push him out. He figures if I can't have it, no one can, creating a gigantic shipping problem for Europe. So now Eisenhower is enraged. The Arab world is completely up in arms, and an oil crisis is looming. Eisenhower is going to take decisive action. He's actually going to cut off all Western oil to Europe until the crisis is resolved. He's trying to put pressure on France and Britain to get out. He will not allow the International Monetary Fund to give gold to England, who needs it, and the value of the pound is going to drop dramatically. He finally threatens economic sanctions on Israel. If you can imagine that in today's political climate, but that's what Eisenhower does. And it works. The British, the French, and the Israelis leave. Egypt essentially goes back to the way it was in terms of its territory. But the long-term effects are going to be dramatic. This is really going to be the end of Britain as a major dominant world power. Certainly the end of them as a dominant power in the Middle East. Nasser, for his part, will become a great world leader. He will be an enormous figure throughout the remainder of the 50s and really through much of the 60s. I don't hear a lot about Nasser anymore, but he's a really important and interesting guy in world history. And of course, this leaves a vacuum for Western interests in the Middle East, and America is at this point going to step in and become the primary outside power in the Middle East. We had, before this time, pretty much left that up to Britain, who of course had been a great world power, but after their humiliation here, and it is humiliating, both the French and the British Prime Minister will resign within the year, largely over this issue. With those two countries no longer able to exert this power in the Middle East, it will be the Americans who move in and begin getting their hands dirty directly in that part of the world. Eisenhower will create something called the Eisenhower Doctrine, which I'll get into probably in a later conversation, that says that we're going to move to prevent or to help any country that is being threatened by Soviet communism, which will create this, set the stage for some of our future involvements in that area and the rest of the world. As for Nasser, we'll actually begin to get along with him a little bit better in just a couple of years, because a group of Egyptian communists will rebel against Nasser, or not rebel against him, but will begin demonstrating in Egypt. And true to his word, Nasser is not sided with the Soviets. He puts them down as well. Nasser is not picking a team. At times he does what America wants. At times he does what the Soviets want. and that will actually raise Nasser's prestige. Nasser will go on to try to create a massive Arab state, and he'll actually merge Egypt. This is friendly. This is not a takeover. Merge Egypt under his rule, or under his presidency anyway, with Syria from 1958 to until that falls apart in 1961. And he will be the man that most of the Arab world looks to for leadership until his own prestige is whittled away by disastrous failed wars against the Israelis. Eventually, Egypt will cave on this idea of needing American military and financial aid when Anwar Sadat basically cuts a deal to stop going to war against Israel, recognize its right to exist in exchange for American economic and military aid, which is that process is begun by Kissinger and then, of course, finalized by Jimmy Carter. Interestingly, after Sadat's assassination, the presidents of Egypt will become Mubarak, who, of course, is the guy that was protested against recently in Egypt. Anyway, that's the story of Nasser, Arab nationalism, the Suez Crisis, and how America got so involved in the Middle East directly. But I also want you to think about the Cold War when you think about that story. We're so conditioned to think of it as there were two powers in the world, and everybody picked a side, and then there was this long period of tension. But not every country in the world accepted that, and Nasser certainly didn't accept that. And it's an interesting kind of outside look at it, I think. Anyway, that was TYT History. Check out my other videos at TYT Nation under TYT History. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something.